So our ideas about consciousness, what experience is, what Dave in his beautiful talk spoke about, the feeling of the Umwelt, the feeling of the world outside us or even within our bodies, really goes back all the way to ancient Greece. And these ideas are really preformed to an extent that's really remarkable by the gentleman in the middle, one pointing upward, that's Plato, and the other one pointing downward, that's Aristotle. And their ideas, particularly about the soul, which is really the form of an organism, and there are different types. So Aristotle, particularly most famously in his book De Anima, talks about different types of souls. He talks about the vegetative soul, which is really the life principle, which really today we think we understand. It's biochemistry and cellular life. Then he talked about the sensitive soul, which is really what today we mean by consciousness, which still remains very mysterious, the ability of animals and humans to experience the world, including their own body. And then he talks about the rational soul, and the rational soul that's common only to humans, or to particular types of humans, adults, and that enables us to speak and to reason and to do things like mathematics. His ideas about whether or not these souls were immortal is not clear. He certainly thought they were immaterial, but under some reading or another most common reading of Aristotle, he thought that when the body dies, the form of the organism also dies with it. Plato, of course, very often begged to differ, and through the Neoplatonists, these ideas entered Christian thought, and then through Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, it sort of became the standard dogma that many people, or most people in this country, still believe in, that at the heart of me is this immaterial thing, this soul that really constitutes me. And of course, science doesn't really has great difficulty with this notion, and the way we scientists think about it is that that what we call our experience is formed by parts of our body, which I'll talk about. So it's the consciousness, if we can lower the light here, the conscious experience that I talk about is really any experience. The most banal, just walking around or feeling things, like Dave talked about, or the most sublime experience that you may only have once in a while or very, very rarely. And now if we can turn off the lights here, what you can see, this is one very striking experience. If you keep your eyes very still and just look at the central cross at the center of the screen, what you should see typically people will say what they see. Well, do you see one or two or three or four of those blue dots, those disks disappear? Maybe we can dim these lights too here. So what's the disks are there all the time. It's a sort of surprising illusion because these, thank you, perfect. Because these blue disks are highly salient. It's called motion-induced blindness. It's one of hundreds of illusions that psychologists have invented over the last several centuries. But sometimes you see the blue disk and sometimes you don't. They're always physically present on the screen. Your eye will always respond to them. So your eye will always signal the presence of them. But somewhere inside your skull, sometimes you have a distinct experience of the blue disk, one or more of them, and sometimes you don't. Where's the difference in the brain? This is a question that I've set out many years ago together with Francis Crick, the molecular biologist who discovered or co-discovered the molecular structure of DNA. We set out to explore. Now, for the longest, and certainly at the time of Aristotle, because he's written about it, people thought that the organ responsible for things like this is your heart, right? Really until the Enlightenment, our thinking about the soul was completely dominated by cardiac-based thinking. We can take the lights up again. And even today, we have this everywhere. We speak about, I love you with all my heart. For Valentine's, I give my wife, heart-shaped chocolate, although it should really be a hypothalamic-shaped chocolate that I should give to her. We have hundreds of sacred heart academies in schools. We don't have a single sacred brain academy and you never see Jesus with a glowing brain. You always see Jesus with a glowing heart. So that's remnants of this old belief that it's really the heart. But we know through heart surgery or through 200 years of science and medicine that you can sort of replace a heart. The real you is not in your heart. It's in one particular organ, namely the brain. So what is it we can say about consciousness sort of from the user point of view? There are many things we can say. We know that consciousness doesn't require behavior. You don't need to behave in order to experience anything. We all know this because tonight you're going to go back home, you're going to fall asleep, and then you'll wake up inside your sleeping body and have experiences. Very vivid experiences. You can fly, you can make love, you can meet long lost or dead pets and people that you've lost. All the while your body is paralyzed because during sleep parts of your brain are actively parts of your brain actively prevent you from acting out your dreams for obvious reasons. We also know this from the clinic. There are lots of conditions like catatonia, or there are famous patients, MPTP patients, the so-called frozen addicts, that couldn't move at all, yet were fully conscious. And in the clinic, Melanie, I think, will speak a little bit about patients that are unable to move, like locked in or like complete locked-in patients that are utterly unable to move, yet have a fully conscious life like you and I. So we know that consciousness the ability to have experience does not depend on you having to act. We know that consciousness doesn't require emotions, although, of course, many of our conscious experiences are of an emotional nature. But again, we know this through the clinic, where you have people who have lost part of their brain and have an utterly flat affect, don't show any of the major emotions, at least, yet are fully conscious. We know through lots of clever experiments that people have done over the last 30 years that you can attend to something without being conscious of it, which seems very counterintuitive, right? Because your teacher always told you, pay attention to me. But it is true, you can attend to things selectively. In other words, your brain can selectively process something without you becoming conscious of it. So you can experimentally dissociate paying attention to things from being conscious of those events. This is important because just like in any other science, when we try to discover the basis of something, we really need to isolate that phenomena from other things that sort of only indirectly or relate to it. We really want to come to the roots of consciousness. And so the roots of consciousness are independent of behavior, they're independent of emotion, they're independent from the ability to attend, although clearly in normal life these things are related. We know that consciousness doesn't require language in people, and of course animals don't have language, nor does consciousness really require self-consciousness, consciousness of self. It's one particular type of experience that we have, particularly we adults. Children or babies have much less self-experience, and other animals have it to a limited extent. But that's just one aspect of conscious, being able to experience myself and being able to think about myself in the past, in the future. And consciousness does not require long-term memory. We also know this from patients. It's not yet clear to what extent consciousness requires short-term working memory. Now, as I mentioned, the organ of consciousness is the brain. It's not the heart. It's also, if you think about it, there are a whole bunch of other organs in your body, and they don't seem to be associated with consciousness either for not entirely clear reason. For instance, you probably all know you have a second brain down here in the gut. It's called the enteric nervous system, a couple of 50 to 100 million neurons. Typically, you don't experience them. When you feel, for example, nausea, or when you feel a feelings of fullness, it's a cortical. We know it's a feeling generated by cortex, not by your enteric nervous system. You have immune systems. You have an innate immune system. You have a very complicated adaptive immune system that protects us from viruses. In fact, so I arrived here yesterday from Seattle. It's a different immune environment. My body might be fighting off a virus that's local to San Antonio, but I don't know about it. I have no conscious experience of it. Why? It's not clear. Last night I had a margarita here at the beautiful Hotel Emma, so my liver is busy metabolizing it. I have no conscious experience of my liver. Now, why is that? It's a physical system like this. Both are physical systems subject to the laws of physics, quantum mechanics, general relativity, etc. It's a biological organ. It has ionic channels, electrical activity, similar to stuff here. But for some reason, I have no conscious experience of this, but I have conscious experience of a particular part of the brain. And that's a mystery that sort of this aspect of research tries to unlock. So here's a brain. It's a human brain. David put it well. It's a mystery why this sort of tofu-like substance, there's 3 pounds of it, why it seems to be one of the few pieces of matter in the universe that seems to generate consciousness. That's really the question we're trying to answer. Why is it that this thing inside its protective skull, how is it and why is it that it can generate conscious experience? That is our life. Remember, the only way you know that you exist, this was, of course, René Descartes' famous insight, cogito ergo sum. The only way you know it exists is because you have conscious experiences. And these conscious experiences of the world come prior to anything else. They come prior to our knowledge of natural laws, of physics. People say phenomenology comes prior to physics, comes prior to anything else. The only thing that you have direct access to are your own conscious experiences. And then from that, using an inferential process, particularly the inferential process of science, you infer that there's a world out there, that there's other people and other actors and dogs and cats and stars and sequoia trees. But that's all inferential. So the question is, what aspects of the brain are really responsible for consciousness? Is it the entire brain? Is it bits and pieces of it? And what is it about this piece of matter? It's a piece of matter like any other piece of matter, subject to the same law, but somehow it seems to have something additional that presumably this piece of matter doesn't have. All right, so as I mentioned, I worked on this for the longest with Francis Crick. And then what we did, we said, well, let's focus. This was back in the 90s. Let's focus on something very concrete that we can do, because philosophy hasn't done also well over the last 3,000 years tackling this problem. So like always, what happens as the science becomes more advanced, sort of philosophy buds off and turns into a new science. And so now there is this new science that we're here celebrating today in the various speakers of consciousness. And so what we advocated for is, let's say on the left you have a scene through my left eye, me sitting at home on the sofa with looking at my glorious Bernese mountain dog, Ruby. Right? So that's my conscious experience. And on the right is a schematic of a bunch of cells in my cortex that somehow are responsible for it. So the question is, and this is known, the search for the neuronal correlates of consciousness, like the footprints of consciousness in the brain, NCC. And so the idea was there must be some mechanism somewhere in the brain that's specifically responsible for generating the experience of that. So, and if I have a different experience, if Ruby is gone, then I have a different experience, and there will be slightly different neurons or some different neural mechanism that gives rise to the absence of my dog and her peculiar smell and the emotional response I have to her. Furthermore, if I inactivate this neural mechanism by intervening, for example, using a device like transcranial magnetic stimulation that the next speaker will speak about, or I lose it because I have a stroke in that part of the brain, then I will be unable to have this perception. Right? Conversely, if I have some technology where I can artificially trigger this mechanism, for example, using the electrode of a neurosurgeon during neurosurgery or some other fancy technology, then I might well have that experience, although Ruby isn't present, but I still have that experience. So for instance, this night, I dreamt of her. So obviously she wasn't present because she wasn't present in my hotel room. She's back in Seattle, I think. But somehow the same neural mechanism that gives rise to the conscious experience when she's there will also give rise to this experience in my head when I'm in the privacy of my bedroom and it's all dark. And so the challenge is to move those things closer and ultimately map them onto each other. So ultimately what we want to do, one of the things we want to do, we want to understand what are the exact neural mechanisms that give rise to any one conscious sensation. And what's common What's common about the neural mechanism that gives rise to visual consciousness versus auditory consciousness versus somatosensory consciousness versus consciousness of self or of death or of any other things? Do they involve the same physical stuff? Is it the same neurons? Is it something subneuronal? Is it something quantum mechanical, as some people have averted? What is the common element? And who else has it besides me? You presumably, if you come to the lab, we can presumably see something similar. What about babies? And we can go across the entire animal kingdom. So there are several common techniques that we use to do this research. So one of them is, I get you, for example, inside a scanner or an EEG device, or during neurosurgery when the surgeon has to put electrodes into your brain. And I show you a stimulus very quickly. Here, for instance, I show you on the left, very quickly I flash up this face that you can barely see. And in fact, I flash it so quickly, half the time you see it, you see a face, and you tell me, yes, I saw a face, and you can maybe tell me something about it. The other half time, you don't see a face. So now I collect all the responses when you actually see a face here, and I collect all the responses when you didn't see the face, and I contrast them, right? Where's the difference between when you see a face, then these particular parts of the brain light up. Here, your eyes is active. The back of the brain, that's the visual cortex. And these are various parts of cortex that are active. When you didn't see the face, well, you're still seeing something, right? It's not that you don't see anything. You just see this chiaroscuro, pattern of foggy stuff. Different parts will be active. And then I can subtract. So I can say, well, the contrast between this and this, these are the brain region that appears to be active when you see specifically a face. Now remember, in both cases, the same physical image was present, right? So it's not the difference in the input. This is really the difference in your internal perception that give rise. So these are parts of the neural mechanism that appear to give rise to the experience of a face. Now what about experience per se? The whole enchilada, as it were, right? So there are different techniques that you can use in the clinic, or you can also do in the lab. So for example, you can get a person to lie inside the magnets with eyes closed, not doing anything in particular inside, and then you can, you get some activity, and then you can compare that. You take the same subject, and the subject, she goes into deep sleep, into deep non-REM sleep. When if you wake her up afterwards and you ask her, did anything go through your head? She says, no, I didn't experience anything, which is not uncommon, of course, in deep sleep. And then you can look at the difference between that. And then you see different parts of the brain light up. In particular, you also see parts of the brainstem light up that are responsible for mediating the difference between being conscious as such and being unconscious in non-REM sleep. Right, so these are different techniques. So one technique focuses on the specific content of an experience, visual or auditory or somatosensory. The other one focuses on the difference between being conscious and being not conscious at all. Now, as experimental scientists, you have to control for all sorts of things. Because not in sleep, there are lots of things that go on. Here, for example, in principle, you could move. Here, you can't move. Here, you have access to memory. Here, you don't have access to memory. So you have to worry and you have to control for all those things. And then particularly you have to, this is conceptually really important, and lots of people, including clinicians, don't really understand this. You have to distinguish the mechanisms that directly give rise to any one conscious experience from background. So we all know your heart has to beat. If your heart doesn't beat, you're not going to get blood into your brain, and you're not going to be conscious. Your lungs have to also operate to get fresh oxygen into your hemoglobin. Again, we know this because if you suffocate, people have done this experimentally. If you put a cuff around the neck and you pull it tight, people will faint after 6 to 8 seconds because there's no power reservoir in the brain, really. But that's not part of those are enabling factors, or those are background conditions for consciousness, but those are not the direct neural mechanism that give rise to any one conscious experience. Same thing, there are lots of mechanisms in the brainstem. We know this over the last 100 years. Particularly, this was first discovered by this gentleman, von Economo, who studied the sleeping sickness. Many people don't have forgotten this horrible episode of an encephalica lethargica that spread throughout the planet in 1917 to 1927, probably killed roughly 1 million people, called the sleeping sickness, where people went into profound, most of the people who were affected went into profound sleep lasting 20, 22 hours for weeks at a time, and many people died. And we know that's due to this encephalitis affecting particular mechanisms in the hypothalamus and part of the brainstem. So we know those mechanisms, they need to be present in order for you to be conscious, but with them present, but cortex, so cortex being the outermost shell, if cortex is destroyed, then even that the brainstem by itself is unable to generate consciousness. And it may well be possible with technological means, even if the brainstem is destroyed, like due to a stroke or something, we may be able to artificially replace the arousing factors, the arousing signal that the brainstem gives by artificial means. So those are background conditions. Now, if thinking about consciousness and how it relates to the physics of the body, there are a number of surprising things. For instance, there are lots of neurons here in the spinal cord, but they have neurons, they have action potentials, they have synapses, they have these little spikes, the way that neurons communicate with each other. So they have everything you expect of a nervous system, yet if you lose them, you become like Christopher Reeve, a quadriplegic, unable to move, yet you're fully conscious. Right? Christopher Reeve was fully conscious. We know this is part of the motor pathway. And they don't give rise to consciousness. So it can't just be the hypothesis that many people have, oh, consciousness is just neurons doing their stuff. Because here they're neurons doing their stuff, but they seem to have no direct relationship to consciousness. More even striking case is the cerebellum. So you probably all know there's a little brain at the back of our brain here. It's called the cerebellum. It contains 69 billion of your 86 billion neurons, so roughly 80%, 4 out of 5 neurons in your brain are in the cerebellum. If you lose them, or if you never had them, you'll become ataxic. If you go to the doctor and you test this, or you test this with closed eyes, you typically test for cerebellar lesions. So you'll have all sorts of deficits, but these patients never complain about loss of consciousness. Some of the most beautiful, in fact, I would argue the most complex and the most beautiful neurons in the brain are in the cerebellum, so-called Purkinje cells. Beautiful fan-shaped neurons. You have a couple of millions of them. They have complicated dendritic spikes, electrical activity, everything you expect of a nervous system. Yet if you lose them, you don't have a loss of consciousness. In fact, very rare, this is a very rare patient born without a cerebellum, so-called agenesis of the cerebellum. She could speak. She had a family. She could speak with some difficulty. She could walk, etc., but with some difficulty, but she was clearly fully conscious. So once again, consciousness is not just generated by neurons doing their thing, because then if you lose all those neurons, you should have some massive loss of consciousness. We know since several hundred years, this is emphasized by artists, that you don't see with your eyes. Yes, right now, in order for me to have a conscious experience of the audience, the information, the photons are captured, the stream of incoming photons are captured by the photoreceptors and then transmitted on through this output nerve, the optic nerve, to the rest of my brain, but that's not where conscious experience happens. In fact, even once we get into cortex, so as I mentioned before, you can feel at the back of your head, you have a little bump, it's called the ilium, and just like a finger's width above it, that's where your visual cortex is. So if somebody whacks you there with a baseball bat, or you fall backwards onto the floor, not to be recommended, you get flashes of light because the mechanical energy is converted into neuronal activation there. So some people said, well, anything that's in cortex, surely that gives rise to conscious experience. But there are lots and lots of experiments that shown that doesn't seem to be the case. So you can show under many conditions in both experimental animals as well as in people that you can have lots of neural activity there. You can have millions of neurons that fire in your visual cortex without you becoming conscious of it. So it seems to be consciousness associated with the higher echelons of cortex. And the next speaker after me is going to talk about that, Melanie Bolle. But essentially, there's what people now call a posterior hot zone, an activity here in the broad back part, the occipital, temporal, parietal lobe, that seems to correlate best with experience particular somatosensory experience, auditory experience, and visual experience. Those have been the best types of experiences studied in the lab and in the clinic, including the experience of willfully initiating actions. A couple of beautiful experiments in neurosurgical patients where if you stimulate regions here in the back, people have this urge to move, to initiate specific actions without actually acting them out. We also know this from lots of electrical stimulation experiments in patients when you can stimulate particular parts of this posterior hot zone, and you can get specific percepts, like percepts of faces or distortion of faces. Now, if this is true, this raises the next question, raises a host of questions. If this part of the brain is really responsible for consciousness rather than the front of the brain, where's the difference? In both cases, it seems to be cortex. There are lots of neurons. There are 16 billion neurons in cortex. Roughly, they seem to look alike here and here. Is it the connectivity? Is the connectivity different here, different from here? And why would the connectivity matter? So those are questions that people are trying to answer. Furthermore, you want to chase it down. You want to sort of track down the footprint of consciousness to its layer, not just here, that's a very broad area, but what is it within this specific neural tissue? Cortex is by far the most complex, highly organized, active physical system in the universe. What is it about that cortex in particular? We know there are different types of neurons. There are roughly 1,000 different cortical cell types. Which one is specifically involved? What are the exact circuits? This all matters to us. Now, what about consciousness in other creatures? So here you have two mammals, my daughter and her beloved dog, Tosca. We believe, well, certainly anybody who's ever been around dogs, that they're conscious. I'm not saying they have the same consciousness as you and me. My dog, or Tosca, doesn't sit there and wonder why her tail wags in a funny way, or maybe she should go to the doctor. She's sort of much more in the here and now. She's sort of much more mindful, certainly, than either my daughter and I. So why do we believe that dogs and other mammals share this gift of consciousness with us? Well, the similarity of behavior. I mean, they don't talk. But as I said, babies don't talk, and you know, your grandfather had a stroke, doesn't talk either. Charles Darwin wrote very eloquently about the different ways dogs can communicate their emotions and their internal states to their human companions. You know, wagging the tail, the ears, you know, the bark, the timbre, the pitch of the bark. Lots of ways to communicate, and this is true of all mammals. Brain architecture is very, very similar. So if I give you a little quinola grain-sized human brain, a dog brain, piece of a mouse brain, nobody but an expert armed with a microscope. And even an expert, I tried this at my institute at an all-staff meeting with 300 people. I showed them different individual cells of mouse and of human. I removed the scale bar. Even these experts are essentially a chance telling a neuron or piece of brain, if you remove the scale bar, whether it's a mouse or human. The basic stuff is all very similar. We have 1,000 times more, roughly. That's the biggest difference. We have 1,000 times more brain matter than a mouse, maybe 30 times more than a dog. But of course, there are other creatures, like a dolphin or like whales, that have 2 or 3 times more than us, which is a little embarrassing. We share close evolutionary kinship, so most genes, are shared among all of us. What we have is language, clearly. We have a highly developed sense of self, and we have a highly developed sense of our own importance. That's really what makes us different. So if you study different animals, you really become very humble because you see each animal special. And we always say, well, what's special about human? Well, every animal is special because it's evolved to its own Umwelt. And so the brain has adapted, not just the sensory periphery, the one that David was talking about, but also the cortex itself has adapted to its own Umwelt. So the good news is that means we can use some of these animals, particular mice, we can use them to study the basic mechanism. I mean, this is also what medicine has done for the past 50 years. You use a model organism like a mouse to study the fundamental mechanisms and to develop drugs and other things and therapies first in mice, and then you can translate that into human therapies. Just to show you, this is my favorite mouse movie. I know you're probably all into cat movies. cat videos. Now look at this mouse video. Just to show you what a mouse. Very persistent. It's like a grad student trying to write up a thesis. Yes. So I'm showing this too. I mean, I find it very, very difficult to deny that this creature, based on its behavior, and we can all empathize with its behavior, and based on the close nature of the underlying hardware, to deny that it has conscious experience, that somehow only we experience the world, and this creature doesn't. I find that very, very improbable. All right, so I'll give you one sort of recent experiment coming out of the lab. So the last paper Francis Crick ever wrote, this is the desk that deals with that the day after he died, because in the hospital when he was dying, was dictating on the day of his death, he was dictating correction to it. It's about a mysterious structure in the brain called the claustrum. Claustrum, meaning hidden away. It's a part of the brain that all mammals have. It's, here you can see it, diffusion tensor imaging from a human brain. It's roughly yay big. It's here and here. You're on both sides. It's underneath the cortex, but above the basal ganglia, embedded in the white matter. In the white matter meaning all the cabling. It's within the cabling of the brain. It's very thin, so it's very difficult to see in functional imaging or in structural imaging for that matter. So we don't know a lot about it in human brain. It's so therefore it's quite mysterious. And Francis was always tantalized by the fact that it seems to be very widely connected. We now know it's the most, for its volume, it's the most widely connected structure in the human brain. It's more widely wired together with other parts of cortex, particularly with cortex. So as you can see, it gets input from all these cortical regions, and it projects to all these cortical regions. And Crick and I hypothesized back in 2005 that its role could be akin to the role of a conductor in the symphony. You have a cortical symphony where you have the individual cortical regions that do their thing. So you have one cortical region that's involved in motion processing, and in smelling, and in somatosensory, and in theory of mind, and all these other things. And of course, conscious experience combines all of that into one whole integrated experience. And so you need some structure that mediates this integration, and that the claustrum has that function, that it integrates all this information that it receives from cortex and then sends instructions back to it. So with the exception of one spectacular patient a couple of years ago, when she was stimulated just underneath the claustrum, sort of she turned into this. Every time they stimulated her, she would sort of stare for as long as the electrical current was active, and had no memory for it, and it wasn't an electrical discharge. With the exception of this one rather tantalizing patient, it's been very, very difficult to reach into the human brain to get selectively at the claustrum. We don't know it has the highest concentration. We just had a meeting with one of the world's experts on LSD and psilocybin and other hallucinogenics, and we know it has the highest concentration of the underlying serotonin receptor anywhere in the brain. Now, so what we can do in a mouse, we can't do in humans. We can do sort of using transgenic animals, which are animals that we've engineered using the power of molecular biology to express specific genes that we can turn on or off, or we can inject, we can sort of dye these specific neurons with fluorescent dyes. So here what you see, maybe we can dim the lights again. spectacular technology, what we can now do called whole brain reconstruction, where we can look at individual neurons and reconstruct individual neurons where they project throughout the entire brain. So here you have these are the input dendritic trees of these neurons. They lie in the claustrum. They're just 6 neurons, 6 tiny neurons in the claustrum, yet they project, as you can see there, oh, thank you, perfect. The wires project everywhere. It's really astounding, throughout the entire cortex. So you have these tiny neurons that sit inside the claustrum. The neurons are indicated by these bright green, yet the output wires in the 6 different colors, there you can see them. And for obviously a reason, we call these crown of thorn neurons, because they look like a crown of thorns. Really quite remarkable. So whatever the function is of the claustrum, it projects very widely through cortex. Not through the entire brain, but through cortex. And then what we can do, we can now, because what we'd like to do, we'd like to image those neurons, to look at them while the animal, to try to read the animal's mind while the animal is undergoing some task, and then also, yeah, I guess it's okay. And then turn the neurons on or off. So again, we have this fantastic technology called optogenetics that enables us in these experimental mice to turn specific group of neurons on or off. So here what we've done, using a device called Inscorpix, we have a tiny, tiny microscope, less than a gram, that's carried by the mouse. You see the mouse is happy, exploring its environment, doing its thing, but it has mounted a little microscope that peers through a tiny lens inside the claustrum neuron. So this is the first time ever that people see the activity of individual neurons, because ultimately, as David beautifully emphasized, all your conscious perception, everything you know about the world, everything you know about you and you, the fact that you exist, arises from the flickering activity of lots of cells. And so here we can see, slow down so you can see it. We can see the activity of individual neurons. So we're starting, we've just done this now. So now we can observe in various tasks that the animal does. How does it relate to the behavior of the animal? And we can turn these neurons on or off with beams of colored lights. We can excite them, and then we can inhibit them and see how does this affect the behavior of the animals. And ultimately, of course, we need to go back into humans through clinical trials or other things, but that's much more challenging. So that's why right now we study the basic mechanism of this at the neuronal level. All right, so in the fullness of time, there's no question to me that this neural correlate of consciousness program will run its course. And that means ultimately, sooner or later, we'll know what are these specific mechanisms, subcellular, maybe cellular, network-wide, that give rise to any conscious experience, and we will be able to read them out in patients that are, for example, unable to signal, and we might be able from the outside to influence them, like using a matrix-like technology. All of that will come to pass. However, that does not answer a number of questions, and so I'm going to finish with pointing out a few questions that we need to answer to that this experimental program will not be able to answer. This is partly a lead into the next 2 talks. So if it's true that neocortex, so neocortex is a sheet-like substance, so your neocortex is roughly this thickness, 2 to 3 millimeter of my jacket, and roughly this size of a 12-inch pizza. You have 2 of those sheets inside your skull. Why neocortex? Why not the cerebellum? Why not the spinal cord? Why not some other parts of the brain? People have hypothesized, including Francis Crick and me, that synchrony, neuronal synchrony, the fact that neurons signal together, that they send these action potentials out together at the same time is important. Well, during epileptic seizure, part of your brain, or maybe your entire brain, is hypersynchronized. But typically, when you have this generalized seizures, you lose consciousness. So why aren't you hyperconscious there? What happens during deep sleep? It's not true that your brain is turned off during deep sleep. Some neurons continue to fire. They fire in different ways, but they still fire. So why is consciousness lost during deep sleep? What about what about patients that have no behavior, like an extreme locked-in syndrome, because they had a stroke in the pons, yet they still have full range of conscious experiences? Is a patient like this This is a patient of Nico Schiff. There's some islands of activity left. He says one thing over and over and over again. Is he just a zombie, this little tape, on loop, but there's really nobody home? More hard questions. When does consciousness start? What was your first conscious experience? Was it when you exited the birth canal of your mom and you went from the protected, warm, sort of darkish environment into the light when you had to breathe yourself and you had this massive surge of noradrenaline? What about a fetus? When does a fetus, is a fetus conscious? I mean, clearly it's alive, but is it conscious? Or what about like this picture here, preterm, a 24-week preterm infant? It's clearly alive, but does it already experience the world? What about Canopagos twins? So here, these are two little girls that live north of me in Vancouver. They have what's called a thalamic bridge. So due to developmental malfunctioning, the two brains literally are interrelated. And there's some claims that one girl, they look in different directions. One girl can look over there, and the other girl who looks there knows what her sister is seeing. There's some evidence that maybe at night they merge into one mind. Is it one mind or is it two mind? I mean, imagine you're essentially, is it possible you can have one mind with 4 cortical hemispheres? What about sleepwalking? Are you conscious in sleepwalking? Your eyes are typically open. Are you conscious? What about, this is an experimental question that's now coming to the forefront, brains in a dish. So you may have heard people can now develop, they can essentially go to my underarm, take some cells out there, put it in a dish, add 4 transcription factors, wait 3 to 5 months, and then you get these little cortical organoids. They're like 1 millimeter or 2 across. It's done now at Harvard and at Stanford and in Vienna. There are 1 million neurons or so. They all have my DNA. They're beginning to show some simple electrical activity. At what point does this little mini brain feel like something? It's a question that neuroethicists now begin to think about. In fact, if I can develop this, and we will be able to do this over the next 20, 30 years, to develop sheet-like cortical organs, just like here, but now in a dish. Well, if I provide them with activation factors that usually my brainstem provides, will this thing be conscious? Will it feel like something? That's always a question, consciousness, right? Will it feel like something? What about animals that are very different from us, that don't have a cortex, like bees? Bees are highly complicated. They have 1 million neurons. They can do tasks. They can learn as quick, and I believe some evidence seems to suggest even quicker than a mouse or rat. They can recognize individual faces. They have very complicated ways of finding their next nest. They have simple ways to communicate using the waggle dance. So how do we know it doesn't feel like something to be a bee? What about group mind? People have forever claimed that there's group consciousness above and beyond the consciousness of individuals. Can this be true under certain conditions, and how would I know? And then, of course, the challenge for our age that's increasingly becoming more critical given the very rapid development of machine learning techniques. Alexa and Siri, they're becoming very sophisticated now. You can talk to them. In 20 years, within our lifetime, we will not be able to distinguish a sophisticated Alexa 20.0 from any other human. The way these things will talk, the range of conversation you will be able to have with them will astound us. And of course, after a while, we'll get used to it because we think the world was always like that. So that raises a profound question. Does it feel like something to be Siri? Does it feel like something to be Alexa? What about robots like Ava? Does it feel like something to be her? Or are they just zombies? Are they just more sophisticated versions of washing machines or of Teslas, devoid of any conscious experience? So those are the questions that really sort of a purely experimental, clinical, neuroscientific focus on the neural correlates of consciousness will not answer. And with that, I leave you. Thank you very much for your attention.